Hey, this is Zach Log the Great, and I am here with my friend Chris, who will be joining me for what hopefully will be a regular feature on my channel in the future. Say hello.
Hi there.
And today, Chris is joining me to discuss the poem I just recorded and posted yesterday. Well, yesterday when I'm recording this, now that I think about it. The poem I posted and recorded on Monday, March 12th, which is Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came by Robert Browning. And anything you want to say before we really get into it, Chris?
We could just start.
So I think one of the most obvious questions when you after you finish reading this and when you're really thinking about it and what it means, does he win? Like, is this whole thing a good outcome for him or not? And it's really not immediately obvious. So what do you think?
I think he wins. He seems to achieve the object of his quest. I feel like the question then is more, does the success have any meaning? Because you can succeed at something that is completely pointless. It doesn't feel great at the end. There is a release of tension, like the quest is over, but yeah, it's not immediate that it has any actual significance.
Yeah, and also I don't know why. Well, I guess you also don't know what he's doing when he gets there, because like it seems unlikely that just reaching this was the point. It seems like there's something that's supposed to happen when he gets there, and what that is would significantly influence that as well, because it certainly seems like he's expecting that he's gonna die here. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Because
Like throughout the whole poem, death seems to be on his mind. Death, decay. Even from like the beginning, like whenever the man directs him to where he's going, he just feels like something terrible is happening.
well, and also he says, what is it? There they stood ranged along the hillsides, met to view the last of me. And so, again, what it is that he thinks is going to happen is not clear, but he certainly seems to think part of it is him dying. And so there's a definite ambiguity at the end there, which, since it's the end, it kind of changes how you read the entire thing. So what's your impression of the end? Do you think this is a win for him or not really?
I think it's a win in that the torture is over. Just it's not that he's like achieved something good. It's just that all that he's put himself through, it's he finally gets the release from that. Just you could tell he is not in a good frame of mind throughout all of this. He's just continuing on because that's just what he does. Uh, Apparently, he's lost friends along the way, people he admired, he's seen them fall, and he just keeps going just because that's all he knows. And at the end there, finally, he sees the opportunity to stop.
And yeah, it's definitely throughout the majority of the poem, there's a very bleak outlook, and it's give me a second. It's not just his own. It's not just his own fate, I mean, he's, like you said, he's seen friends die, and not just die, but die badly. Die in disgrace. Oh, and apparently betray their ideals and fail at everything they stood for before they die, which is I would say significantly worse. And so, and of course, the entire world, as he describes it, is a pretty is a grim one as well. So,
one part that kind of stuck out to me is whenever he sees the horse and he says, "I never saw a brute I hated so. He must be wicked to deserve such pain." The thing that got me about that is he's in the same place as the horse. Like, he's been run ragged. He's in the same desolate area. And he's looking at this pitiful creature and thinking that it must have done something horrible to be here. But he's in the same spot himself.
right. I mean, yeah, especially since he is the only active character in this. His comment on the environment is, obviously it's pretty obvious that and one interpretation would be that all of that is a reflection of him, and is a reflection of what's going on inside him. Which, I mean, I also don't think you want to overdo that too much, or else you just get into solipsism. I like, there's the inside of you and there's the outside of you, and they're not the same thing, even in a story like this. But yeah, there's definite. I think there's definite element of reflection there.
Right. So all the pain he's going through, he may feel like he deserves it, because he just keeps going on. No matter what he feels, he just keeps moving forward.
Well, and there's also, it doesn't seem like he knows anymore why he's doing this. It's just, it's what he has to do. It's what he's supposed to do. And so what is it? Relatively early on, he says, "For I had so long suffered in this quest." And, in something well written, word choice is deliberate. It doesn't say, "For I had so long suffered in my quest." He said, "In this quest." And so it doesn't even seem like he personally identifies with this anymore. It's just what he has to do. Which I think also, is an interesting reflection on the tone there.
Right. And there was other people on this quest, and each one of them proved to have some major character defect that prevented them from achieving their goal. I mean, we're only given 2, but it seems like at the end there's quite a few people that he sees or imagines watching him. So it could be, since he's watched his allies fall one by one, he sort of imagines that within him is also a failure that's going to come out somehow.
Well, yeah, and the other part of that is he let's see. Yeah, and it only gives the details of 2, but he says that just to fail as they seem best. Failure is what happens with the people who try this, and then he wonders if he's even good enough to fail, which is a strange problem to face. But and then all the lost adventurers, and this one was strong, that one was bold, and that one was fortunate, but all of them failed. And again, you have to. It seems fair to assume that in a story like this, that they failed because of something wrong with them. I think definitely another interesting thing about this poem, considered as a story, is the very dreamlike nature of the world he's passing through. Like things don't seem to happen. Um, don't seem to have a normal, cause and effect. He takes a couple steps off of the highway, and he turns around, and it's gone. And he's walking along this plain for miles and miles, and he looks up, and there's mountains all around him, and he has no idea when that happened or how he failed to notice it.
Right.
And so, yeah, any comment on that?
I definitely see what you're saying there. And even just the way he describes things, like it comes across as like a very pessimistic manner, like obviously, but at the same time, like if somebody is not in their right mind, they're sort of drifting in and out. I could very easily see their mind run away with just small details, like just seeing death and everything, just imagining corpses under the water. Uh, that definitely fits with sort of a really dark and twisted dreamscape.
It is also interesting to me. There's the speaker. Obviously, there's only one other actual character who appears as present in the story. There's two in the kind of flashbacks, but there's only one other character who actually appears in the story, which is the cripple who gives him directions.
Yeah, and he immediately just assumes that this person is just evil and lying to him and pointing him to his doom. Except at the end, we find out, no, like, he was going in the right direction. So he was assuming malevolent intent. But at the same time, this guy actually put him on the right path.
Well, that's also hard to figure out because he says, you know, my first thought was he lied in every word. But then he also says when he's about to follow the guy's directions, he says that ominous tract, which all agree hides the dark tower. And so he says, I think this guy is lying, but he also says everyone knows it's over that way somewhere. And so it's give me a second. My best read on that one would be that he knew the guy was pointing him in the right direction, but that the cripple also said the cripple also meant harm for him to come to him on the way. And does that sound reasonable?
Somewhat. It could be that he knew that was the right direction, but he also figured that he would never make it. So just like pointing him to his doom without actually lying.
What was so are there any parts or features of this poem you particularly liked or particularly disliked now that I think about it?
Like that's the thing though. Like I actually do like this poem. It's very pessimistic, it's very dark, but at the same time it pulls you in because that's the mindset of the protagonist. So just as it keeps going on, just describing these things in just a dull and dreary manner, like you're actually sort of finding yourself thinking the same way as the protagonist is. So then at the end, whenever he suddenly finds himself like at his destination, like you don't really know how to feel, but you also get the impression that he's not entirely sure how to feel about it either. So it kind of pulls you into that role along with the protagonist.
Well, one other interesting thing, it's kind of ironic. The I think one of the most hopeful signs for him at the end is how often he's been wrong before. Because there are several times, in this, like we were saying with he said the guy was lying, but at the same time he ended up pointing him in the right direction. And there are a few other spots where he says something that very quickly is proved to be is proved completely wrong. And oddly, like at the end, the fact that he has such a bad track record on his predictions seems to be well, maybe his assumption of what will happen at this point is also wrong.
That is true, and it could just be all the darkness and dreariness of it is actually completely within his own head. Like he could just be so exhausted, just so worn out, because again, he assumed that the old man was lying to him. Turns out the old man was telling the truth. And like at every point of the way, like he is just seeing the absolute worst in whatever is happening to him. So it just could be that it's saying more about his mental state than what is actually happening here.
Well, yeah, and like the other thing, what is it? My first thought was he lied in every word. Mouth scarce able to afford suppression of the glee that pursed and scored its edge. And so he says, he can barely keep, this malevolent grin off of his face, pretty much. But apparently he is keeping it off of his face. So again, the main character is appears might be completely assuming this guy's state of mind, and wrongly so, because scarcely able to afford suppression of the glee, but if he is suppressing it, even if barely, then maybe it's not there at all. And there was actually another something you brought up when we were talking about this earlier. Is Roland the protagonist? Is Roland the speaker? Which is something I'd never thought to question. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So just we're given everything from his perspective. So there's not really any reason why we would know his name from that. And then at the end, he never says like Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came. It said that he put the slug horn to his lips and blew it. And just, it could be that is like a song that he's playing on the horn. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that his name is Roland. But I also don't see any like definite evidence that that's his name. I can see other ways to interpret that.
Oh, and that actually reminds me. It doesn't seem like a bad idea to talk for a couple minutes about the history of this poem and how it came to be written. Because let's see, Robert Browning wrote this poem based on a line from King Lear, and the line from King Lear was, who's the character? Oh crud! I don't remember the character, but it's someone pretending to be mad in order to disguise himself and stay safe from the forces of the crazy daughters of Lear. And among his babblings, he said, "Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came."
Yeah, it looks like that character's name is Edgar.
Edgar. Okay, I was gonna say that, but I wasn't sure. But anyway, and he says, and he, among his other pseudo insane babblings, which is something that shows up a few times in Shakespeare. There's several places where people are like, oh, maybe it'd be good if I looks like I was nuts. So among his pseudo crazy babblings, he says, an isolated line, "Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came," which comes. Would you like to explain that? Explain where that came from further?
Well, I just looked around a little bit, and from what I could tell, there was an earlier version of the Childe Roland story where his sister went around a church Windershins and found herself in Elfland and was kidnapped by the Elf King. And Roland had to go and rescue not only her, but his two brothers who went before him and failed to rescue their sister. And I do think it's interesting, even if Browning didn't know about this story, that it still has multiple people attempting a quest and the people that went before failing.
Well, and the other, of course, for a lot of modern readers, they're not aware. Elves and fairies were not always the kind of creatures that pop culture tends to think of them as today. Sweet and benevolent. But I think the best, probably the best single term to describe them would be alien, or other. And they weren't always bad, but they certainly weren't always good and sweetness and light. And sometimes they could be, and you if you have any dealings with them, you have to be very, very careful, because sometimes they can be downright malevolent,
Right.
for reasons. Go ahead.
Right. You're just dealing with a culture that is so different, not only just like human culture, but we're talking about another species. So stuff that might obviously be good to you could never cross their minds, and stuff that's good to them would seem terrible to you. So you just really have to watch your words carefully. Now, one thing that does seem to be consistent is they tend not to lie. They tend to be relatively honest in their dealings. It's just you have to be very careful the wording of those deals.
Yeah, and to go with this tangent a little further, I think it's kind of the same process that happened to the popular conception of angels, where in the Bible, and if you read any of the old stories, an angel shows up, and almost every time the first thing they say is, "Don't be afraid." And well, why is that the first thing they say? Because your natural reaction to seeing one, it would be pure terror. They're not these cute little babies with feathery wings. They're something that if you saw one, you'd be changing your pants shortly afterwards.
Yep.
And it's what is it actually seems to me something, and on a complete tangent from the poem now, because this has nothing to directly do with Childe Roland to the Dark Tower came, but it actually seems to me like something our culture has really lost, the idea that good can be, that something that is good can be at this exact same moment can be terrifying, and something good it might not necessarily be safe. And I think not having that idea, I think we've really lost something important.
Yeah. I mean, if we think of things that we consider good, like having a child, like today, I mean, it's not easy, but it's relatively safe. Whereas, like just a few hundred years ago, that could be a death sentence for women. That could just be so dangerous, and even now, like it's not easy by any chance. But this is something that we believe is good, but it's also terrifying.
Well, and I have two children of my own, and it's so speaking on the other side of that, uh, it is. I would never go back. It is definitely good, but it is also like, give me a moment. The thing most important to you in the whole world is now walking around outside of you, and there are times when you will be able to do nothing, at all to protect them, and it's also a very scary thing. So it's still good and terrifying at the same time. So.
Right. And anytime you attempt to do something great, like there is always the chance of failure. So yeah, like just good and terrifying can coexist. Good and painful can coexist in the same thing. Now, I don't know if you had anything more to say about that, but anything talking about the Dark Tower, I feel like we kind of have to jump to Stephen King.
I was wondering if you wanted to bring that up. Yes.
Like I may have read this whenever, like I was in college or maybe high school even. It did not stick in my mind at all. I am mostly aware of it from the Dark Tower series.
So what did you want to put in about Stephen King's version of the story then?
Well, for one thing, I think even if it's just the sheer length of the series, you do get a sense of Roland, the protagonist, just constantly moving and chasing after this thing that through most of the story just feels so distant. You also get bits and pieces of his allies that have like fallen over the course of the quest, and he just keeps going on and on just because that is all he knows how to do.
Yeah, it's on TV tropes they call that that kind of character the Determinator, who they're one of their defining features is they just keep going and keep going, and they're not going to let anything stop them. And now that I think about it, I mean, I think that fits the character of Stephen King's books. I don't know how well that describes this character here. Well, because what you hear, yeah, it is hard. It's hard to assess it because what you hear him say several times is things along the nature of ready to give up, despair, and wanting to stop, and yet he keeps going. So I don't know.
And we're going to. This is going to be a spoiler for the Dark Tower series. So if anyone hasn't read it, you can skip ahead for a moment. But at the end of the Dark Tower series, he gets there, and you do actually get to see him enter the tower, but his work still isn't done. And he basically has to restart from the very beginning. And this time there's an indication that something might change, but he also has to go through it all again.
Yeah, it's and the way those books end, it's it goes back to the very beginning of the series. In fact, pretty much the exact moment the first book opens. But he also has something else with him that he did not have the first time. And I actually my impression of that was that he had done this. I don't know if it actually says that. I got the impression that he had done this many times before, and that that he had gone through that process where he would go back to the same point with something else changed.
Right. You get the sense that there is forward momentum, but it's just going really slowly. So in the poem, the protagonist gets to the end, and you don't necessarily know what happens past that point, but there is an end. Whereas Stephen King takes that feeling of just constantly moving, just still having work to do, just haven't finished yet. And then the character Roland in his series, like, that's just all he is. Like, even once he gets to the end, it's nope, you're just starting over from the beginning. So he takes that feeling that's present through so much of the poem, he stretches it over an entire series, and then just sets him right back at the beginning of again.
So one interesting bit from this poem that I wanted to comment on. It's one of those things where you see someone from, in this case, over 100 years ago, commenting on something, and or at least appearing to, and you say, oh, they were dealing with that then too. I kind of thought that was just something today. Let's see, shortly after he leaves the highway, and before he crosses the river, and he's describing the landscape, and he says, if there pushed any ragged thistle stalk above its mate, the head was chopped. The bents were jealous else. And so he says, okay, if any of these weeds, if any of this scrubby, gross plant life actually grew above the level of the rest, it was cut down. Because if it wasn't, then the other ones would be angry that anything was higher than they. And I think the parallels to today's society are with that are pretty obvious. But I didn't know that this was a thing that 150 years ago that people were dealing with then too.
I could see that, but at the same time, this poem is put in like such a pessimistic manner that even if Browning is aware of that argument and that's what he's referencing here, it doesn't necessarily means that he buys that argument.
Well, and that actually, speaking of the pessimistic or cynical tone of this, I think it's also interesting to talk about some of Browning's other poems. Are you familiar with any of other Robert Browning's other poems?
I'm sure I've read them. I'm actually looking through one of my old English literature books now, but I cannot remember them at all.
Okay, there's three others I know off the not memorized, not that kind of know off the top of my head, but there's three others I can reference off the top of my head. There's My Last Duchess. There's I can't remember the title. It's a guy is dying and he's giving instructions to his heirs on what to do with his estate, essentially, including an extremely valuable piece of art that he stole. And then there's Porphyria's Lover, which ends with this guy strangling his lover to death with her own hair. And so for those not familiar with it, My Last Duchess is this man is talking to the speaker is talking to someone else. He's trying to negotiate his next marriage, which in medieval or Renaissance times with the nobles are often at least are commonly more political alliances than anything than romantic or affectionate. And so he's trying to negotiate his next marriage with this other house, and he's telling him about his last wife, who it turns out he had killed basically because she was too nice to other people. And so there's 4 Robert Browning poems I am moderately familiar with. Well, 3 I'm moderately familiar with, and 1 I'm now very familiar with. And they're all very cynical, very kind of dark. What's the word? What's the monologue? What's the name of it? There's a term for it, but they're I was talking to a friend about this the other day, and it seems like Robert Browning was maybe the Chuck Palahniuk of his day. So have you found some of the others? Are any of them ringing a bell?
I know I've read The Last Duchess at one point, and I'm just kind of skimming over it, and yeah, it's been a long time.
So it's but yeah, I'm actually going to have to look up a few others of his and just see whether he has anything that doesn't fit into this general mold. But it's definitely a prevailing attitude in his work. I kind of think I've covered all the main things I wanted to talk about. Was there anything else you wanted to mention?
I think we hit everything that struck out to me.
Okay. Well, then thank you for joining me, Chris. Hopefully we will be doing something like this again in about 2 weeks. And thank you for watching, and God be with you.
Y'all have a good one.